Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today I'm talking with Lafayette Lee, who is a anonymous Twitter user who has quite an audience, I would think it's fair to say, on Twitter. And he's also an editor with IM 1776 magazine. Well, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
And I just call you Lee.
Yeah, that works. Lee's perfect.
And how did you come up with your handle?
Well, I love history, and Lee's an old family name. It's not my actual surname, but I come from the Lee family, and so I've always been interested in like Richard Henry Lee. Obviously, everybody knows Robert E. Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee. The whole family is just very interesting family history. So kind of interesting there, and then my son loves Lafayette. Like we're just a big history family. And so I don't know why. It's just on a whim. I just thought I'd throw the two together and start my account. I never had any expectations that the account would grow at all. So people ask me often, and I did not have much of a plan. I just kind of threw it together and jumped on.
Mm-hmm. And are you a Southerner?
Yeah, so I grew up all over the place. I bounced around a lot. So part of my life spent in the South, other parts in the West as well. And then I joined the military, and so I moved all over the place. But I feel the most at home here. So I do live in a southern state, and I got a lot of old family history here, and things that are my kids have been raised here, and so yeah, it's kind of where I call home. But I did bounce around a lot as a kid, and so I have an affinity, I think, for the South and the West. I feel like there's a mythical quality there, something very special about it. I feel like it's kind of the cornerstone of American history, and so it's something I love talking about.
I lived in Kentucky a long time ago for 5 years or so, and I was talking about this on Twitter the other day about how of all the places I've lived, Kentucky has felt the most like home. And part of the reason, and this is something I think many people have a hard time grasping, is that Kentucky in particular has to me what you call a mythic quality, but always to me feels something more like a haunted quality.
Mm.
That at least the areas where I lived felt like very thin places, like the other world was close there. I don't know if you feel that way or not, but about the South or the West, but I definitely had the sense of it when I lived there.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely feel that. Some that's always, I have a lot of my people way back. We can take a drive, with the family and go see old cemeteries and graveyards where, our ancestors are. And yeah, I mean, it's something that I've always kind of just felt. There was one time when I took the kids out to go see where the first of the Lees, came. He basically, like, I think it was in the sixth, I can't remember exactly which year. It might have been like 1632, I think he came, but he had a plantation out in the middle of Northern Neck, out in on the peninsula here in Virginia. And I took him out there, and I mean, it's just this small family graveyard, and it's got, a marker there, and it's in the middle of the woods. It just feels very otherworldly. And I remember taking my kids out there, and it was kind of like this very special experience, because you feel so close to these things. But I think this is why, like you said, there is kind of this quality to it where there is a little bit of a haunted feel. Um, and the West, to me, what's interesting is the West feels almost otherworldly too, but it almost feels like another planet at times. And I just find that intersection between the two regions are just really interesting. They just bring out really strong emotions. The sublime, there's a sublime quality to both. And so, sorry, I don't mean to ramble. I just, yeah, couldn't agree more.
It's interesting. I In a sense, I am a Midwesterner in that I grew up in Indiana, but I grew up in a part of Indiana that was primarily settled by Scots Irish from the South, whereas a lot of northern Indiana, for example, was settled by Germans and Scandinavians. And years ago, after I moved from Kentucky to Ohio, I was talking to a coworker who had moved to Ohio from Nashville and previously had attended the University of Georgia. And I said, we've been here for a while and I just can't get used to it. I hadn't thought about it at all. And he said, it's culture shock. And when he said that, I realized that is entirely true. That a lot of Midwestern culture, for example, is so different from what you would find even in the South, even the northern South, like Kentucky. And it's hard to put my finger on exactly what that is, but maybe you have a sense of what I'm talking about.
No, absolutely. I find that really interesting. I know there's a person on Twitter, Roland Gunn, who I love when he kind of goes through this um, ethnography, and I think the physiography of America is just really fascinating because you have these pockets of culture and folkways, and there are geographic boundaries. People, when they talk about the South, for example, they will always identify it by like the old secession map. It's like who seceded, and that's a good place to start. But there's so much there's these pockets as well, and people don't realize that after the war there was so much migration from the South. Obviously everyone's very familiar with the Black migration,
Mhm.
from the South up to places like Harlem and so on, big cities. But there was a lot of migration period, so there were, people will know the Okies, but there were lots of Southerners that were white Southerners as well, or come descend from Scots Irish, for example, that relocated to different places and they lived in communities like that. I mean, you could go to Southern California and there are old families there. The old California families are Southerners, really, like originally, Patton, for example, even though he's from California, was a Southerner, really, like that's his family. And you have that Scots Irish side. I really find that interesting. I mean, the Scots Irish in America is probably one of the most amazing stories, and there is a definite culture that I think many of us today, like it just kind of slips through. We don't really think about it until, like you said, like we do start to notice it when we start to experience the shock or when things start changing. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's fascinating. Indiana has that. I've noticed that in West Virginia, parts of Pennsylvania. Just really interesting.
Mhm, mhm. You're an editor for IM 1776 magazine. Tell us a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about art and culture. We do talk about politics as well, but that we try to take a different angle on that. There's a lot of just, political chum out of the water these days. So we try to take a little bit of a more in-depth look on deeper things that are happening. But for me, I've written a lot. I'm passionate about this country and its people. It's something I feel is very special. And I like to talk about our history and to kind of explore uh, aspects of our culture that people don't appreciate. And so all of us as the different writers and editors, there's really runs the gamut of the kinds of things that we talk about, but there's usually a deeper cultural component. And then, like I said, my writing, like I like to write a lot more about America and like what it means and who the people are and who we are. I find that that's really interesting.
Why is that important? Why is America important?
I think to me, America is important because it really is an exceptional. In human history, it's really an exceptional place. Um, I believe, and this is just me, but I do believe that it is blessed, and I believe that there's a providential quality to this country and its history and its destiny as well. I think America is a special place because it was really the roots of religious freedom, for example. They were able to, I mean, they had been found in other parts of the world, but this is where they took hold. And this is where religious communities were able to thrive and achieve a type of pluralism that kind of solved some of these religious conflicts back in the past, been very difficult and very, had been very traumatic. I believe that that's something very special about this place. Also, just the quality of us becoming a people, a unique people that are separate from Europe or, where many people come from. And obviously, we have other populations as well. So I'm not just trying to speak from just one, but, just looking at myself, many of my ancestors came from Europe, but they, over the course of living on the frontier and becoming a new people, with a real unique culture of their own. I find that's a very special thing about us. And I think that a lot of the problems we see in the world today, although obviously we contribute to those, sometimes we are the cause as a nation. I believe that we also have the wherewithal to solve many of the problems that have bedeviled humanity for a very long time. And I know we're at a low point right now. People are very despondent, but I do believe there's a promise at the root of it all, and I hope that we can live up to that.
So let me make the argument that others on the right might make in response, and you tell me what you think.
Yeah.
So in the process of America becoming its own people and forming its nation, even in terms of developing religious pluralism and the problems that essentially American liberalism solved, the low point that we see today is a result of the fruition of the seeds inherent in that founding. And that there is no way out of this low point without overturning that founding in some substantial way. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I think this is I've heard this argument many times. Some I've wrestled with, so I take it very seriously because many people I really respect come from that place, and that's the way they interpret this. So my response to that is that while America, I would say after the founding, found itself kind of imbuing taking a lot of that founding ethos, and it took on kind of a more Gnostic quality. And what ended up happening, I would say over time, is that rather than hold to the political infrastructure that had been built up, and what I'm talking about when I say this is the Constitution as a document is a good example of this. There's a difference between the Declaration and the Constitution. As the Americans of the early republic would have been more prone to see it as it literally was something that severed us from Great Britain. And it was an intricate argument in the height of revolution to be able to say that we have the right to revolt, like we have the right to break away because the monarch and parliament and so on, they're really violating a more ancient system of rights that we've always had, and really the foundation of all of this. The whole point of having a king and having a parliament and all this, it all goes back to these ancient rights and privileges that we are owed. And what's happening now is that because you violated that, we actually do have a right to revolt. So it was a very difficult argument to make at the time, but they were able to make it successfully. And it was in the understanding it in the span of history, it makes a lot of sense. This revolution. Now, when it came time to to draft the Constitution, very different process. By the end of that, they resorted back to the old procedural ways of doing things where states came together and they were able to agree on a very minimal amount of a very minimal government, but not by imbuing it with these lofty principles. The Constitution was stripped down from those things. And that's because at that point it was time to govern, right? And why I'm belaboring this, the whole point I'm making is I think there's a lot of there's a lot of benefit from exploring it from the angle of looking at this as a triumph of liberalism, or a triumph, or looking at the philosophical foundations, looking at the principles involved. Those are real, and they grab hold of us. Lincoln, there's a reason why Lincoln invoked the Declaration of Independence at the Gettysburg Address. There's a reason why they use this. In the span of history, it makes a lot of sense. Similar to what Lincoln was doing is what the Thomas Jefferson was doing with the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, but why I'm saying this is because the answer to me is actually it's political. I do believe, and when I say this, I believe that what we're seeing all around us with the lack of morals, and people are we're in a really rough spot morally as a people. There's a lot of degradation and decay. I recognize the gravity of these things, but there are many problems that can be solved on that are on a political plane, similar to how the founders came together, the framers of the Constitution came together, and they fell back on a very old political principle rather than trying to imbue this document with these high-minded, lofty principles. It sounds counterintuitive, but I think that I don't believe that the seeds of the founding are the cause of the problems. I believe it's a failure of true politics, classic politics that we would attribute to somebody like, when we talk about Aristotle and so on. This has been a failure of politics. There's a reason why we got here, but I don't believe by solving the liberalism problem that it will solve the problems that we think they will. Although I find the argument very persuasive. That's where I come out on that.
All right, let me push the argument a little further. But first, let me say I am largely agnostic on all these matters, but I think it's interesting to hear someone more committed than I am to an answer. Interesting to hear what you have to say. So here, let me ask a question that may sound odd, but I think you will understand it, and if I need to explain it, I will. If the 13 colonies had inherently the right to revolt against the king, okay? If states have the right to do that, the moral right to do that, how then can we say that any given individual does not also have the right to revolt against cis heteronormative patriarchy and identify as an asexual butterfly person whose pronouns are flutter and flutter self?
Right. No, that's a good critique. I would say that ultimately, I think when you stretch it out and you look at the history of this principle of being able to revolt against a given power, there's successful revolts and justified revolts, and there's revolts that are not. And we've had many revolts and insurrections throughout the small scale insurrections. There was one big one, but we've had small scale insurrections, from the very beginning. The difference is there's a couple things, and this is why I think politics matter. When you look at a successful revolution, and I don't really even like to use the word revolution because to me, the American Revolution was an attempt to preserve an existing regime or framework rather than create one out of whole cloth. And that's what I think a lot of Americans are very misguided on their own history with this. The reason why it was successful, and the reason why it became morally justifiable, is because the case was successfully made and it was resolved. I mean, obviously, it was resolved through an open insurrection revolt, so violence, but there was a moral case that was made, and it was by reaching back and very much like the Magna Carta, being able to make the case by being more true to the historical experience, to the principles underlying the given regime. And where I'm going with this is this is why I think politics matter, is because these things cannot just the good guys don't always win, and it's not like making a good philosophical argument does not mean that you will be successful. And so although I find it very important to make a good strong philosophical argument, politics matter because this is when the sausage gets made. This is when the Constitution gets ratified. It is through a much different process. And so where I'm kind of going with this is that somebody can say that they're going to revolt against the system, and they can say, like, they could say, I want to liberate Palestine, and then they have this political project. They want to separate themselves, or maybe they live in Berkeley, and let's say Berkeley wants to separate itself from America and not, go by the UN Charter or something like that. And these things will happen, but I'm more interested in the fact that having a good, strong philosophical argument is very important, because at the end of the day, what it's doing is you're galvanizing a cause that you need people to be part of. And if you can win, then you reestablish something, or you establish a new regime, or you have a soft regime change. And we've seen this happen in American history many times. I mean, FDR did this, if you really think about it. But there's a difference between successful and unsuccessful. I recognize that this is a very fluid area, and I don't think we appreciate that enough. But if you can win it correctly, you can impose the vision that you have for the nation. That's why I think it's so important that those of us who don't agree with the him herself stuff, and we have to be able to engage politically to reassert something new and better, because if we keep doing the rearguard action, it will not work. And we can make the philosophical argument, and it can be pure and right and true, but we'll still lose. And that's kind of where I'm going, if that makes sense.
Yes, let me see if I understand. I think the argument underlying the question I asked is that if a people, as Americans have enshrined the principle of revolution as a kind of central value, philosophically, there's no stop on that.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is we enshrine the notion of revolution, and eventually that becomes a part of that American culture that you're talking about, that leads to the freedom of every individual to revolt against essentially every social norm. I think what your answer to that is that, while you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is that while that may in fact be the case, that philosophically, the enshrinement of that principle leads directly to what we're seeing today. I think what you're saying is that that there's an intervening political process which introduces into the social milieu, I guess, for lack of a better word, many countervailing forces that should keep an idea like a revolution from running to its logical conclusion at a social and political level. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. I think that's exactly right.
Yes, I think that. Right. Okay. So now I understand. So and so then your answer is we need to do a better job of introducing into the political life of our people, reintroducing countervailing and limiting principles on essentially radical individualism and revolution as a first principle. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. And one other thing I just add to that is that this goes way back, because if you think about it, and people don't often agree with this, but it's really the truth from my reading, is that what came before the American Revolution, even in English history, there were revolts and revolutions that toppled royal dynasties, political dynasties, changed things. You have the Magna Carta is like a big one that we know, but the seeds were there as well. And so often, like, I'll get people on the dissident right that will talk like Curtis Yarvin's argument, and they'll say, well, America has this like unique revolutionary quality, and it is more high. Obviously, it's more highly charged. But like the founders themselves knew that they came from a people that had revolted before. That they had come from a world that had been, the residue of violence and sectarian violence was just everywhere. So it's like this, they weren't coming up with a truly novel concept on this. But where I'm going with this, though, is that the thing that I think has been the most pernicious today is that there is this revolutionary quality that we are seeing that is been highly charged through, I think, Marxism. And I'm not saying it's Marxist, but Marxism has had its effect. Mm-hmm. And I would say that we have a problem where this vast majority of Americans who are just normal, decent, good people who have come they've lived through this historical period of peace, relative peace and plenty, and the political machinery seems to have worked and all this. The problem is that most Americans have slowly been divorced from the political. And when I say this, I'm not talking about mass politics. That's the problem, is that seems to be the substitute that everybody goes to. Like if I watch the news and I get angry and I yell about it on Twitter, like that I'm getting involved in politics. That's not politics. And where I'm going with this is that we do have countervailing forces, and they aren't always political entities, right? But some of them are. But like our churches and our homes, our communities, our family cultures, these things all occupy the same space. They can either be part of the, this irresistible movement, or they can become part of this immovable object. But we all want to have a little more sovereignty, a little more control over our daily lives. We feel like we're being swept away. And my argument for people is there is a political infrastructure machinery that has been left over that is often just sitting dormant. Mm. What are you doing about that, in your own communities? What are you doing about, like, how are you investing yourself in the sphere of influence that you have now? Like, to engage politically is not to watch the news. It's not to argue online. It can be useful to an extent, but really, like, where you are making real crucial decisions for yourself and your community, and that you're advocating for your own interests. There's opportunities all around, and although they are retreating because of this mass politics, people, I don't think, take advantage of this. And this is a real problem for our side. I guess people that want to put a stop to some of these things, or at least have a little more autonomy. And so my argument is that people need to understand those countervailing forces. They need to be courageous enough to use them. And they need to understand that, like, it is their right to do so.
We wanted to talk a little bit about kind of localism as a source of political solutions. And I think you've begun to bring it up, because I think essentially what you're saying is people should run for city council. Like when you say to engage politically, I think what you mean is everyone lives somewhere that has some form of political governance. Mm-hmm. And those opportunities are available to people at the local level. And the individuals at the local level could work to reintroduce countervailing forces that would stand against the revolutionary spirit of American life. Can you tell me a little bit about how you see localism and what you see as its strengths and how it might work in our current context?
Absolutely. So there's a few things when it comes to the localism piece. Not everybody's a political animal, and I respect that. I don't think that bread and butter, like going out and being on a zoning board, is for everyone, right? But I think we need to understand this as it's really us clinging to our particularism, to our own particular interests, our relationships, what makes us who we are, right? I think mass politics really strips us of our autonomy. It strips us of our true identity. It strips us of relationships that are more real. and it creates kind of this pseudo network of relationships that aren't really real or sustaining. And then we're so easily conquered because essentially we're giving up autonomy to be part of something that we end up serving rather than it serves us. So I do think that on a local level, there are many opportunities for people to take advantage of political positions if they have the qualities that could serve their community or serve the people around them, that they could do. But I also encourage people to do other things as well, and to recognize that there's a quality about other actions that is just as important, if not more, and still there will be a political product or they're kind of a byproduct of their activity. So examples of this are like, I think people need to re-engage. I mean, we've been kind of like swept away with this digital transformation of our daily life, and it's been really great in many ways. But we have to kind of reroot ourselves in the real world. In my local community, we've had many different the same kinds of pressures that other communities face, and it's not all just solved by somebody running for the city council. It's really people being it's people being interlaced amongst them, each other again. It's having communities know who each other are, being able to interact with one another on a different level, a different plane that doesn't have a political character about it. Here in my community, we have porches. Everybody's got a little porch, and we do pie on the porch as neighbors. That has maybe political stuff will come up in a conversation here or there, but we don't focus on it. It's who we are. This is our particular neighborhood. This is our particular area, our families, and the relationships we have that are built around other things. But this creates a strong sense of unity and camaraderie, and we have bonds, some between marriage, others just between proximity. But see, these are really important because it helps us to secure a place to stand, so that when things like when we had somebody tried to have a local drag show come to our small community, we already had this group of people, and those who were interested, we were able to talk about this situation. We were able to make some plans, and then we had the right people to communicate with, and we were able to put a stop to something like that pretty easily. But it is because of the foundation that we had first. We didn't just create a caucus, right? We didn't just have a political group. We did not become a 501c3. In a way, this was even superior to that because we're really just a group of people that know each other very well. And we were able to advocate for our interests with the right people and stay on top of that issue. And we were able to put a stop to that one thing. Now, we've had many cases like this of things that start to go into the political, and we're able to act very effectively. But why I say I think this is the right approach to a lot of the political issues that we face today, because it has to come from something organic. That's when it's strong. When it is this kind of top-down astroturfed mass politics approach, like obviously there's money and there's attention and you can crush a bug real quick with that sort of a thing, but it's not long lasting. And so I think that a lot of these other like mitigating institutions that we've had in the past, we need to strike out new growth on this. We need to become interconnected again. We need to know who our neighbors are. We need to find common cause with them on things that have nothing to do with politics. We need to keep those true relationships alive, and that, to me, that will have greater political outcomes than we realize that like we really can't anticipate. This is what we have to reclaim in a way, because we've lost that. And we always look at the political people that I talk about politics with will always just focus straight on the outcomes. But you have to ask, like, why is this happening to these communities? What's going on? Who's living there? There's so much of this has been uprooted that it makes complete sense why we're just getting steamrolled everywhere all at once.
So let me talk about particularism for just a second and make a critique of it. in the way that I see it moving, especially on Twitter. So on Twitter, you see certain localists, particularists, I guess, if you want to talk about, say that, who make much of, for example, their geographic region where they live, where their family's from, their family history, the history of their region. And it's very clear to me that some of this is about building their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that this is a response, that there is at least the danger of that kind of localism and particularism becoming a not very effective substitute for religion. And that one of the reactions to ever increasing secularism is to, rather than turn my soul toward God for instruction about who I am, I look to my family history.
Mm.
And so I begin to identify myself um, as a person from Clark County, North Carolina. I don't even know if there's such a place, but let's imagine it for a moment. And I become a Clark Countian at and I define myself as a Clark Countian over and against American mass culture. And this tells me who I am and fulfills some semi-religious purpose in me.
Mm.
And when the sort of traditional Christian understanding is that those attachments, while perhaps valuable, must be held loosely. I think we can't forget that within the Christian tradition, leaving your home is a pronounced theme, from all the way from Abraham to Paul. And so I think I see some of this particularism moving in a direction where it serves this kind of pseudo-religious purpose. Oh, and mitigates against the ultimate sense that we are souls standing alone before God, and that at our core we are alone with God, and that all of our external accidents of history, where we live, where we're from, who our family is, etc., are in the end irrelevant to our core existential experience. And I think a lot of these particularists, localists, or whatever, almost elevate these accidents of history to a eternal or ultimate significance. That's my critique. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. I actually really that critique absolutely resonates with me, and I think that that is a problem. I think that's and it really speaks to the fact that we are living in a kind of a spiritual wasteland, in some ways. And I notice this as well is that a lot of things become fetishized because there's just that lack of uh, there's a we need that, and I think that that is very important. And on an individual level, it's really hard to. I'm still working through this. I think because many of us all come from different churches and traditions. It can be a little difficult to know how to navigate it right. But I will say, like on an individual level, I absolutely agree. I know that like within my own family, there is a prioritization of God and then family and then other things as well. And those other things are high on the list, right? They're important. But at the end of the day, that is the most important thing. And I think, it's when people do ask, I mean, I have people that will DM me sometimes and, and I know they don't like the answer, and but I can't really lead them another way. They'll ask like a solution to a type of problem. And usually I will say, like, you need to work this out with God. Like, you need to re-examine this. You need to cling to this. You need to cling to God. You need to open up your scriptures, and you need to invest more time in that. And they don't like that answer. And I don't know what to tell them, because for me, a lot of the problems people are wrestling with right now, and like you said, the identity issue is huge. I really do shy away from, I don't like people having to construct an identity necessarily. Like, I understand, like, you can explore that, but it's no substitute for a relationship with God and for understanding yourself as a son or daughter of God, and that you're part of his plan. And so I think that is the most important thing. I couldn't agree more. I think that that is a very good critique. And I think that localism can be, it's like a lot of things. It can be a mechanism, but there should be something. It's not an end, right?
Mhm.
It's a means, but we should have those ends stood well, and we should really know who we are. I don't know. We can't make it through this unless we hold tight to those spiritual things. And so I agree with you. I think that's actually a very good critique, and I think that localists who can solve that will probably do very well. But this is probably like anything, they'll probably be a lot more successful and find that that the localism is done right. But yeah, I agree with you.
If I were going to argue with myself, I think what I would say is that it is as we attend to particulars in our particular environment and we love them dearly enough, spiritually, we pass through them into a wider spiritual recognition of things. And that may very well be true. So, for example, we all have a particular mother, and we might be able to say, well, the more we focus on loving our mother, the more we become like God.
Mm-hmm.
In that we attend to our particular mother with all of her particular needs and frailties. And that may be true. On the other hand, I think still that all of that has to mitigate against particularism and localism as an identity generating mechanism, as you say. Those things must be held very lightly and in the right priority.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think when we're talking about something like um when we're talking about something like family and country and these other I mean, these are very special things, and I understand that those are things that, but it is kind of the problem of modernity, is that we hold to those things, and we begin to fetishize things because we are lacking that spiritual component, and then it becomes kind of pointless, or it becomes destructive. And I agree, and I think that that's partial. That I think the reason why it's so tricky these days, obviously we have the problems of modernity that we always talk about and we understand, but the other problem is that we're being manipulated a lot
Mm.
with universalist principles. And I mean, I just notice this all the time. Is like, obviously, like, I'm not I don't hold anyone's race against them. Like, I'm just not like that. It doesn't really interest me as much. I find race is an interesting component of our lives.
Mhm.
I do think I'm sure I have heterodox views compared to the regime approved narrative about these things. I don't believe all human beings are exactly the same and all this, and I think that's pretty obvious, and everybody really knows that. But the point is like, I don't hold those. I my true belief on human beings is like, we're all sons and daughters of God, and so that's the foundation of how I kind of come at most things, right? So where I'm going with this is that when I have political entities or operatives or activists that are trying to manipulate me or manipulate people with a principle like anti-racism or with equality, and these things in and of themselves might have good aspects to them, and that's why people can agree with them at times, but it's that they become very destructive because they've been completely divorced from the more important things, the crucial things. and they've taken a life of their own. And so I think that the tendency, maybe in like localism, for example, and there's many different things. I just threw anti-racism out there because it's just the flavor of the week right now. But it's like when we start to like dig into that localist or particularist, and we abandon all these other things, we almost deny that there's such a thing as a universal truth. Or I mean, I've seen people kind of go so far on some of this. Yeah, that does become a problem. And I think that there's always, whenever there's something being acted against you, your tendency is to go to the furthest extreme to get away from that. And I do think that there is a risk of losing um, like losing the point, like jumping the shark when you're being manipulated. Because I think that's why people are reacting so stridently against this. I know this is part of me, is because I can feel that I'm being manipulated or exploited by bad actors. And so it's almost easy to go and find the furthest extreme and cling to that as if that's going to solve the problem.
What do you see as the role of the family in mitigating these political and spiritual issues that we're dealing with?
You know, I to me the family is the cornerstone of everything. I mean, it's just so important. You know, apart from our relationship with God and you know the atonement and so on, I look at the family as the most important thing apart from that in my life. And it is really truly the most basic polity. Um, this is this is the place where every person who has a family has the opportunity to learn and grow and to demonstrate these things that we want to see, the good things we want to see in the rest of the world. This is really where it all comes from. All the great people that we all look back to in history all grew up in a home somewhere. They all had influences in their lives, and they had people guiding and mentoring them for better or worse. And I take that responsibility very seriously. I think the things that matter most in our lives are things that require an obligation, the a responsibility. And I love my wife and I love my children. And I know that as a person, I would not be able to understand uh, my I wouldn't be able to really understand the life, the world around me without that experience. I wouldn't be able to be a true leader. I mean, I was in the military, so I learned leadership, but there's something different about the quality of leading your home and being I'm a man, obviously, so being a good husband and father, I can speak to that. It is the most basic polity. And there's I hate using words like governance because it almost feels cheap compared to how important the family is. But like there's a what is a good leader, a good father, a good husband. These things are so important. And if really we can't begin to make the world better if we can't manage to be the people we should be in our homes, if we don't have a good, strong family culture, if we don't raise our children well, if we don't treat our wives with respect, and we don't have strong relationships, I just feel like if we can't manage to do that, like there's really all the other stuff really doesn't matter anymore. If we lose the home, it's the rest of it is just pointless, in my opinion.
Mhm.
So I think that's the cornerstone of everything. I mean, I really look at like America as like all the things that I think are exceptional about it started with families, you know, and I find it very interesting that the person who probably is the biggest hero in American history would be George Washington. That he looked at his being the father of his country is a very important thing, but he was much more invested and proud of being a family man and being somebody who had a good household, and that he was good to the children that were actually not even his own, but that he was a good husband and father. I find that to be very inspirational, and that's the way that I look at politics. Is that it really comes down to what is this doing to families? What is this doing to my family? What are my interests as somebody who has a family? That's really the cornerstone. It's where it all starts.
Well, on that note, why don't we wrap up? Because we've talked for an hour and of course, we've only scratched the surface. We should do this again.
Yeah, no, I've loved talking to you, Dean. I mean, really, like some of your thoughts really made me like take pause. I thought you had some really great things to say. I'd love to hear more from you too. So I'm excited. I appreciate this conversation.
We'll do another one where you can ask me whatever you want.
I would love to, actually. I was just thinking that.
Okay. Um, Tell people how they can find you if they want to follow you. Just on Twitter at Lafayette Lee.
Yeah, if you just go to at partisan_O, and then I also have a Substack. It's called Ruins of Karatamon. It's just LafayetteLee.com. But I share a lot of old family stories and things like that. Just to kind of, I try to tie this bow up between politics and the family. And so, yeah, you can find me there.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.